Don't listen to the badass Oromo. He or she is a person who wants to create hate between Amharas and Oromos.
አቤቱ ረድኤቴ መድኃኒቴም የአፌ ቃልና የልቤ አሳብ በፊትህ ያማረ ይሁን. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my redeemer. Now that's taken from Haile Selassie's Metaf Kedus, the Amharic, and the English is from the King James Version of the Bible, Psalm 19, verse 24. Now the key in there where it says, Befiteh Yamare Yehun, in your sight may it be, the translated word is acceptable. Acceptable, Yamare. May it be of Amara, of Amara. Amara is the root word and the key word that links the Ameru of Kenya with the Amhara of Ethiopia, with us here in the West, the falashas of the West, the Bani and the Beta Israel here in the Western Hemisphere, those who were sold into slavery during the so-called transatlantic slave trade, which originally was the trans-Ethiopic Ocean slave trade. Now, as we mentioned earlier, and we've mentioned before, and we really are intending on doing a more detailed teaching on how the slave trade really encompassed almost the whole of Africa, and how East Africa, in particular Ethiopia and Sudan and even Somalia and Kenya and other countries, were adversely affected by the slave trade. And many of them were sold in the Western Hemisphere, where there were already established so-called the slave ports, where the market of slavery was established in the west of the continent. So many slaves were taken from the east. So there was an East African slave trade, and this is what many of the history books have failed to acknowledge, especially the so-called Anglo-American and Anglo-Europeans, and even many of the so-called Arabs. The Arab slave trade is very important in this regard and this aspect, and also to identify what type of Arabs were involved in this enslavement of the remnant of the Beta Israel. And the key word is the Amara. The key word is Amara. The Ameru, we have the Amare or the Amhara, and then we even have those of us who are sold into the West, the falashas of the West, the exiles of the West, who are known today as African American, but really the true pronunciation would be those African so-called AMHARA-Kins. We are the kin of the Amara, the kin of the Amhara, the kin of the Ameru, the kin of our African Beta Israel remnant that were maintaining on the continent, and many of them who have still maintained to this very day those keys of identity with the Beit Israel, as well as the covenant, the Kal Kidan, the B'nai Berit of ancient Israel. So yes, there is a link. Mocha had asked the question concerning the Ameru of Kenya, along with the Amhara of Ethiopia. Was there a link between those two peoples? Well, of course there are. Of course there is a link, but you have to really go Yah's way, or Yahweh, and through the scriptures and through the Beta Israel and those who are faithful, because there's many of those who will call themselves, like it says in the Bible, many who call themselves Jews who are not Jews. There's many who call themselves Amharas who are not Amharas. You understand there's many who call themselves Ethiopians who are not Ethiopians, and we speak about the native ones especially. And there's many who call themselves Israel and Israelites who are not Israel and Israelites in spirit and not in truth. So we really have to distinguish not just what one called themselves, but what are those key identifying marks? What are those marks that identifies them as what they say they are? So we over here in the Americas are AMHARA-Kins. We are those kin that Negus Neges Kadamawi Haile Selassie prayed concerning, and he spoke concerning, and he made those primary and preliminary links with the African Americans, or the Afro-Americans, as they were called then. They were called Afra, the Afra-Americans. This is interesting. We say African American today, but in that particular day and time, if you look at the literature, it says Afra-Americans, Afra-Americans, a combination of Afar and Amar, Afar-Amar-Kins, or the kin of the Afars and the kin of the Amars or Amirs or AMHARAS. Now, let's look at this word Amar. If you look into the Hebrew, as we mentioned earlier, we mentioned already, Amar means in Hebrew to speak. It means to speak. Now, this is a key link between the Shemitic Hebraic and the Shemitic Ethiopic and the Shemitic Amhara and Amharic, is the link in the meaning of the word. So when we look into Hebrew and we study the Hebrew, the word that is for to speak, like when it says Yahweh Yomar or Elohim Yomar, in the words Moshe Yomar, in other words Moses spoke. You understand? Spoke. Then we have the Psalm according to the Amharic, where it says Redete Medhanetem Ilibe Asabina Ya'afe Kal Befiteh Yamare Yehun Yamare, may it be acceptable. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, in the Adonai sight, in our God and our Father and our Messiah, in the one God sight. The key is Tawahido. The key is Tawahido. Now, when we say the key is Tawahido, to the spiritual way of life of the people, Tawahido. Now, one branch, we have to recognize the different branches of the family, because some branches of the family actually were in the Ishmaelite or the Islamic disguise. Many of them were in the Islamic disguise when you understand what was going on in Africa at that particular time. That many who were Abrahams changed their names to Ibrahim, you understand, and adopted the early Islam that had come to them when they were in certain regions, you understand, that were heathen, African regions that were without the law, African regions that were more tribalistic, and they worshiped their various ancestral gods, and their gods had no link with Abraham, the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. It was easier for those who knew the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov to accept those true Mohammedans or Muslims who were linking with Abraham and much of the Israelite identity. We find this even when we study Quran. But now, since the King of Kings has come, fulfilling that Shiloh role, to him shall the gathering of the people be. So this is why when the Italians and the fascists and the Romanists and the Western so-called Christians, the Antichrist, attacked Ethiopia, even many of the Muslim tribes and the Muslim peoples fought alongside the Christian Amharas against the godless and the cruel dragon during that particular time. Now, we need to understand, well, how come this was going on then, but it seems as though a different crop of so-called Muslims or Mohammedans have come about later on. We have to understand what has gone on within the so-called Islamic religion and the Mohammedan faith that has caused a change, as we can see it in this present time, where there's antagonism to the Solomonic throne and to the Davidic dynasty. There's not that faithfulness, because see, the true Islamic and the Ishmaelites recognize the true heir of Abraham, of Yitzhak, of Yaakov to be the rightful ruler. You see, and that this is why Muhammad even sent his people to Ethiopia, to the Nagash or the Nagashi, to the king, because that king, although he was Christian, he was a Hebrew. So his Christianity was different than the Romanist, the whitewashed Christianity in that particular time and in that particular space. This is why he knew that he would find faithful people among the so-called Gusasian. The Gusasian, we touched on that in the earlier video, the Gusasian. The Gusasian are talking about the Gesawist. You know, it's in the Gesawist, or the Gesawiyan of Ethiopia, those who were monks and those who were priests, and they were not haughty, they were not proud, but they were humble ones of the true faith, of the Tawahido faith that the true Muslims recognize as Tawheed, according to the Quran, in its pristine purity. This is where that important link between Islam, true Islam, and true Christianity took place in the highlands of Ethiopia amongst the Amharas.